Um, so welcome everyone. My name is Lacey Villava. I'm Education Manager at George Mason's Gunston Hall, and I'm joined today by Bethany. Would you introduce yourself, please?
Absolutely. My name is Bethany. I'm a park ranger at National Mall and Memorial Parks in Washington, D.C. If you've never been there or are curious as to what the National Mall is, it's a place where we commemorate a handful of individuals who made important contributions to the creation or protection of this country, such as Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and of course, George Mason, who also has a small but beautiful memorial tucked away in a corner of the National Mall.
I was just saying George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights, which we're going to talk about in just a second as well.
Exactly. Yep. Very important document.
So we're here today celebrating the anniversary of the Bill of Rights, the National Bill of Rights. So I want to start just by getting us all on the same page so we know what we're talking about. The Bill of Rights, I'm sure you've heard of it, is this document that was added to the Constitution after it was written. So the Bill of Rights was first drafted and recommended to Congress in 1787 by James Madison, who'd been really important in writing the Constitution to begin with. He proposed 32 amendments to the Constitution, which is so many. I think about how many that is and how many we actually have, and it's kind of wild. 12 of those 32 got through Congress, were voted on and agreed upon by Congress and sent to the states for their approval. In order to be enacted as amendments to the Constitution, they required 3/4 approval. So 3/4 of the states had to say yes. And from those 12, just 10 were agreed upon by the states, and those became the Bill of Rights. Now, what do they include? They include a ton of things, but there are two major groups that the Bill of Rights includes. One of those is rights about how we express ourselves. That's freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom to gather, to assemble. And those rights include our ability to do things like protest peaceably or write a letter to our elected officials telling them that we don't agree. The second group has to do with how we treat people who might have done something that's against the law. Has to do with how they're treated before trial and during trial and what rights they have in those moments. Now, all of these together are something that George Mason and James Madison called natural rights. And natural rights are something that today we think of as human rights. So these are things that we have inherently as people. And nobody can take those away. But James Madison and George Mason and many people like them were afraid that people would abridge or take them away or limit them in how we engage with our rights. And so not just those two major groups, there was also an amendment that included the statement that none of these rights, or that not all of the rights that might be around, are listed here. And it doesn't matter if they're listed, they still can't be taken away. So today, things that belong in that category are things like the right to go to school, the right to not be forced to marry, the right to leave your country if you want to. Those are all things that are encompassed within that particular amendment. So now that we know about the Bill of Rights, let's think about George Mason and the Bill of Rights together. So here we go. We've got 10 things about George Mason and the Bill of Rights. Number one, this was not the first rights document written in the United States. George Mason wrote the Virginia Declaration of Rights in 1776, when Virginia was first declaring independence from Great Britain. It was one of the first times that rights like these were written down in a document and claimed in this way. Which takes us to thing number two. What was in the Virginia Declaration of Rights and what's in the Bill of Rights? So there are some differences between the two. George Mason included a ton of things that are in the Bill of Rights that are also in the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Things like freedom of religion, that all people are equally free and independent. But there are also things that aren't in the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Freedom of speech isn't in the Virginia Declaration of Rights. There's freedom of the press in the Declaration and freedom of speech in the Bill of Rights. There's also not the right to assembly in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, but that's something that we believe is really important, and so did James Madison, and he included that in the Bill of Rights. Which takes us to item number 3, which is you, Bethany.
Number 3. George Mason wrote the Virginia Declaration of Rights just weeks before Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence. And it's very likely that Mason influenced that massively important document. Jefferson later admitted that he wasn't aiming at originality when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And while he didn't copy from any particular source or previous writing, it's easy to see the similarities between the two documents. Both proclaim that all men are born equal and have certain natural rights, among which are life, liberty, and happiness. We also know that Jefferson greatly admired Mason and once referred to him as the wisest man of his generation. And therefore, it sort of made sense that when they decided to place the George Mason Memorial on the National Mall, they placed it in view of the Thomas Jefferson Memorial because of the connection between the two.
Yeah, it's so amazing which ones you can see from where, and you can definitely see those two from each other.
Yep.
And so we're now on to item number 4. Now, George Mason liked to stay at home. He liked to stay at home a lot of times, he said, because of his family. Mason had a lot of children. He had 9 kids that survived to adulthood. He loved being at home among his garden, among his fields, among his family. But he wrote a lot about things that had to do with the Bill of Rights and had to do with the Virginia Declaration of Rights. He also participated when it counted. He was in Williamsburg when he wrote the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And about 10 years later, he went to Philadelphia in 1787 to join the Constitutional Convention. And that was really important because George Mason was incredibly involved in that, writing that document. He had a lot of things to say about it. But that brings us to a slightly challenging topic, which is number 5. Number 5 is that George Mason was a slaveholder, and he said a lot about slavery. So we're going to show a quote in just a second that George Mason said about slavery pretty early in his career. He believed really strongly that slavery was not a good thing. He says here that it's a slow poison which is daily contaminating the minds and morals of our people. And yet in George Mason's own personal life, he did not ever free anyone that he enslaved. So this is one of the challenging things when we think and talk about George Mason, is that he did continue to talk about rights and continue to hold people in slavery. He had some interesting things about him, though, and things that he thought were really important and things that he was successful at, which takes us to item number 6. And that's you, Beth.
Number 6. George Mason was one of several delegates who knew the Constitution wasn't perfect and would probably need to be changed as time went by and new ideas formed. He even recommended that since the Constitution had been written in secret without the knowledge or ideas of the people, that a second convention should be held to review all of the changes that might be suggested before the Constitution would even be signed. He said, "The plan now to be formed will certainly be defective. Amendments, therefore, will be necessary, and it will be better to provide for them in an easy, regular, and constitutional way." Many agreed, and Article 5 of the Constitution now allows it to be altered or amended. To date, 27 amendments have been passed, including the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote, and the 22nd Amendment, which states that a person can only be elected to the office of the presidency twice. And you can actually learn about all of these amendments on the National Mall at the various memorials that we have there.
I love that you have memorials connected to all of these amendments. I think that's really fascinating because there is so much and so many things that are rights related reflected in the National Mall. And it's just all of it's encompassed in one place. And I think that's really awesome.
Yeah, it's a great place to visit.
But thinking about those amendments, that takes us to number 7, right, Bethany?
Number 7, exactly. Now, in the final days of the convention, Mason suggested that the Constitution actually begin with a Bill of Rights. He figured that people might be more accepting of this new form of government if they knew their individual rights were protected. Mason even argued that a draft could be written in just a few hours. All they had to do was use the Declaration of Rights that many states added to their own constitution as examples. When Massachusetts delegate Elbridge Gerry called for the creation of a committee to take up the matter, Mason eagerly and readily seconded the motion. Unfortunately, not everyone agreed. And on September 12th, 1787, the proposal was unanimously rejected by the delegates. Mason was not happy with this decision. And although he decided to attend the signing ceremony just 5 days later, he refused to add his name. He said, "I would sooner chop off my right hand than put it to the Constitution as it now stands." That's a pretty interesting quote, standing up for what he believed was right. And since it didn't have a Bill of Rights, he thought that the Constitution itself was incomplete.
I think it's so interesting that one of the people who was on the opposing side from him in that argument was James Madison. You might remember from earlier, James Madison was actually the one to propose amendments to the Constitution in the first Congress. But that's because he got some flack. He got some pushback from not having a Bill of Rights when the Constitution was first signed.
Exactly. And many of the delegates thought that the Constitution inherently protected those rights by dividing up powers, while others thought that maybe it would be a little too dangerous to simply write all these rights down. If you forgot one, is it still a right? Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, there was some debate going on, and the decision was made. Well, let's just get the Constitution done.
Absolutely. And I think we actually just went from 7 into 8.
We did, exactly.
George Mason did not sign the Constitution. He was one of the people present who did not sign the Constitution.
Exactly. And not only did he not sign the Constitution, he also campaigned against its ratification in his home state of Virginia. And really, in an effort to explain why, he wrote what became known as George Mason's Objections to this Constitution of Government. And this was a list of 16 things that he found wrong with the Constitution. And of course, the top of that list, there was no Declaration of Rights. Mason actually sent a copy of these objections to several of his influential friends, including Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and it was even published in the newspapers. Unfortunately for Mason, his decision to speak out did come with a price. He did lose many friends, including George Washington, who later referred to Mason as his former friend. But he did stick up for what he felt was right.
Yeah, absolutely did. And he continued to do that for pretty much the rest of his life, which takes us to point number 9. George Mason, again, though he stayed at home, he didn't participate in government in physical ways. He was writing and persuading people that a Bill of Rights was incredibly important for the Constitution. He wrote letters to George Washington even after their friendship dissolved. He was constantly writing to Jefferson, to Patrick Henry, to Madison, and many other of the founding fathers that you might recognize, persuading them that a Bill of Rights needed to be added. And that was actually one of the things that he talked about at the ratifying convention. And one of the things that he continued to advocate for the rest of his life. And so he was gratified to learn towards the end of his life that a Bill of Rights was going to be added, at which point he changed his mind a little bit and he said that he could cheerfully put his hand and heart to this new government. And in December, today, This day in 1791, the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution, and I think Mason ended his life a happy man. Which takes us to number 10. These two sites, the National Mall and Gunston Hall, are places that you can visit today. Bethany, do you want to tell us a little bit about visiting the memorial on the mall?
Absolutely. You're welcome to visit all the memorials that we have at any time. They're always opened and available to you. We have park rangers and staff on site to answer any questions that you may have. We also have a lot of events. We always like to say that the National Mall is a place where people come to celebrate and commemorate, and even to a degree demonstrate. One of of course, the rights that we have that came through the Bill of Rights was this ability to come and assemble and to address grievances. And the National Mall is certainly a place where that happens. And so it's always an exciting, active place, and we encourage everyone to come down. Even if it's just for a few hours to check out all of the memorials that we've got on the mall.
If we want to go specifically to the George Mason Memorial, is there parking there? Do we need to ride the metro? How's the best way to get to the Mason Memorial?
Yeah, actually, the George Mason Memorial is one of the few places on the mall that has a wide variety of parking options. Most other places, we always encourage you to come by metro. But there are a couple of parking lots right next to the memorial. So it's easy to park and walk right up. I will suggest one of the most beautiful times to visit George Mason Memorial is in the spring. There are beautiful magnolia trees there. There's this great fountain in the center. And of course, just across the way is the tidal basin, which if you time it right, might be in full bloom of all of those Japanese flowering cherry blossom trees we have. So it's a gorgeous time of the year to visit that memorial.
I have been before, I will admit, but it's been a while and I haven't been in the spring. So I'm definitely going to have to try to go again. Thinking about Gunston Hall, we're also open year round. We are closed for the first 2 weeks of January for Thanksgiving and Christmas days, but we are open the rest of the time, 7 days a week from 9:30 until 5 p.m. And we do offer tours of the historic mansion and the spaces where George Mason was thinking about and bringing a lot of these ideas to life. So if you're interested in learning more about George Mason, the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and his campaign for a Bill of Rights, we'd love to have you come out. I will also mention that we have some events coming up in the spring. Our next event is a virtual event, History in the Kitchen, where we spend 30 to 45 minutes looking at an 18th century historic recipe and bringing it to life in your modern kitchen. So get ready to cook along with us as we bring that program back in February of next year. And then in April of 2022, we'll be celebrating spring with our spring festival on site, which will include garden-related activities, a plant sale, kite flying, and a variety of other spring fun. So with that said, I see we have a question or two in the chat. This one is for you, Bethany. When was the George Mason Memorial added to the mall?
So it was dedicated in 2002.
And we actually at Gunston Hall were involved in the fundraising for this to be added. That was our campaign in 2000. So we had some financial support in developing that as well. All right, I'm just taking a peek, seeing if we have any other thoughts or questions. I'm always curious about what people's favorite memorials are. So not directly connected, but Bethany, what is your favorite memorial on the mall?
That's a really good question. I have to say, since I am from the state of Illinois, I do always tend to gravitate towards the Lincoln Memorial. So I would have to say that certainly is one of my favorites. I also like the fact that it has definitely become part of the civil rights legacy, and of course the location of both the Marian Anderson concert and the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom.
That's awesome. It is definitely a really moving space with Lincoln as larger than life as he is.
Yep.
I think it's really, really stunning every time I go.
And next year in May, it turns 100.
Does it really? I didn't know
It does
that.
indeed. Exactly. So we are actively planning on how to commemorate and to celebrate, I guess, the 100th anniversary, birthday, whatever you want to say about the Lincoln Memorial.
That's awesome.
It's
So
exciting.
that's the second oldest memorial, right? The George Washington Monument is the oldest one.
Exactly. The Washington Monument was finished in 1884. The Lincoln Memorial finished in 1922.
That's fascinating, kind of the span of when things were added, as early as 1884 and as late as 2002. Quite a span of time.
Yeah, it's one of the fascinating things about the National Mall. It's continuing to grow and it's continuing to add to the story that it tells.
That's awesome. And I will say I'm really excited to be part of that here at Gunston Hall as well. I don't know if you know, Bethany, we are in the process of restoring our Riverside Garden, which is a space that George Mason's son said he was even less to be disturbed than when he was in the So I can imagine George Mason thinking out there, and I've just been watching over the last 2 years, this garden space come to life. And in the recent past, I've been involved in actually planting things there. So just watching this space and thinking about how this was a place that George Mason was incredibly contemplative all the time, and helping be a part of making it come to life is pretty special. We're also in the research phase of restoring what we call the East Yard, and in the 18th century was home to an enclave of enslaved people that we believe were closely involved in maintenance of the house and the gardens and other spaces directly around the mansion. And I suspect it was a place where people like Nell and Chris and Paul, all women who were enslaved and working around the house, were likely living. So I think it's really amazing to be a part of helping to share these stories, and that our stories are so disparate, but we can all see it growing and coming to life.
And I also think that the amazing thing about these two places is that there's always reasons to come back. There's always reasons to visit once again, to see what's been updated, to see what's new, to hear some of the new stories that are being told.
Absolutely. Because I imagine if I went and I talked to you in person, or I went and talked to Ranger Jen, who's helping us keep track of the comments on YouTube, that we would have very different experiences if I went and chatted with either of you. And the same is true of our staff here at Gunston Hall. When you have an experience with me or with one of my colleagues, they're going to be very different.
Yes, exactly. Same on the mall.
Yeah. Well, I'm not seeing any other thoughts or questions being added to the chat. So I think we should wrap up for the day. But I do, again, want to say thank you so much, Bethany, for joining us today. Thank you, National Mall, for being a part of our commemoration of Bill of Rights Day.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for inviting us to celebrate this very important day.
Thank you.